Chapter 1. Clara squinted against the low sun, her fingers tightening around the leather strap of her carpet bag. The creaking of the wagon echoed in her ears, a rhythm that matched the thumping of her heart. "Are we close?" she called out to the driver she'd hired, a grizzled man whose weathered face told tales of long days on the trail. "Just around the bend," he replied, flicking the reins with a practiced hand. "You'll be at Dusty Ridge before you know it." She leaned back against the wooden bench, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Dusty Ridge was a new beginning, but could she truly leave behind the weight of her past? The wagon jostled over uneven ground, and she took a deep breath, allowing the sweet scent of sagebrush to fill her lungs. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A rabbit darted across the road, pausing momentarily to sniff at the air before disappearing into the underbrush. Clara smiled softly at its boldness. "If only I had your courage," she murmured. "What's that?" The driver glanced back briefly, curiosity etched on his face. "Nothing important," Clara shrugged it off, "just thinking out loud." He chuckled as they rounded a bend, revealing a sprawling vista of fields dotted with wildflowers, swaying in a gentle breeze. The sight tugged at something deep within her, a sense of belonging she had long yearned for. "Beautiful country," he said, his gaze fixed ahead. "Not many folks appreciate it like they should." "People often forget to look," Clara replied, her voice stronger now as she gazed out at the vibrant colors dancing in the sunlight. The driver nodded knowingly. "You've got that right. Too busy chasing after things that don't matter." As the wagon rattled on, Clara's thoughts drifted to the ache in her heart. Memories of laughter, warmth, and comfort danced just out of reach. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the vivid images of her family, their faces forever frozen in a moment of joy before tragedy struck. A wagon wheel had broken that day, sending them tumbling into the depths of sorrow. The pain felt like a heavy stone lodged deep within her chest, suffocating her spirit. She remembered her mother's gentle voice reading stories by the fire, her sister's laughter ringing through their home. Now, silence surrounded her like a thick fog. "I reckon we're just a few miles away," the driver called back, pulling Clara from her reverie. She forced a smile, but it felt brittle against the weight of her memories. "Just thinking about home." "Home can be a tricky word," he replied, his voice low as if sharing a secret. "Sometimes it's not a place, but what you carry inside." Clara looked down at her hands resting on her lap, calloused yet tender from countless hours spent painting or tending to others' needs. "I've lost mine," she admitted softly. His expression softened, eyes glimmering with understanding. "I'm sorry to hear that." She shrugged lightly, as if brushing away his sympathy like dust from an old book. "It's been 2 years now, but it just feels like yesterday." "Life keeps moving forward," he said with a hint of resignation. "Yes, it does," she murmured, watching the landscape shift beyond the window, a patchwork quilt of green and gold unfurling under the sun's embrace. Clara hoped that answering Jack Harlow's ad would lead to more than just work on his ranch. She longed for connection and community in a world that had turned its back on her. The thought fluttered through her mind like a restless bird searching for shelter. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her bag, pulling out the crumpled letter. The paper felt rough against her skin, each crease a reminder of the moment she had decided to take a leap of faith. Jack's handwriting, strong and bold, danced across the page, and his words echoed in her mind. "Please, come. I need a wife to help raise my son." Clara swallowed hard. The invitation wasn't just an escape from her past, it was a commitment, a life tethered to another person, to his child. It was a responsibility that weighed heavy on her heart. "What if I can't make a difference?" she whispered to herself, the thought twisting like a thorn in her side. Doubt clawed at her insides. Clara imagined Jack's eyes searching for understanding, for support, for a partner who could nurture not just his son but him as well. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the wind to sweep through her hair and whisper promises of new beginnings. Clara felt the warmth of sunlight on her freckled cheeks, igniting a flicker of hope deep within. This was a chance. An opportunity to build something real in a world that had once left her shattered. The wagon rumbled into Dusty Ridge, and Clara understood immediately why the town bore its name. Wind-swept dirt swirled across the main street in graceful arcs, coating the weathered wooden buildings in a fine layer of earth. A handful of horses stood tied to hitching posts, their tails swishing at flies in the afternoon heat. The driver pulled back on the reins, bringing the coach to a stop in front of a 2-story building with peeling white paint. A worn sign creaked in the breeze. Dusty Ridge Hotel. "Here we are, Miss Bennet." The driver hopped down from his perch, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Clara gathered her skirts and accepted his outstretched hand, stepping carefully onto the wooden sidewalk. Her legs felt stiff from the long journey, and she stretched discreetly while the driver climbed up to retrieve her trunk. "Thank you," she said as he set the small trunk beside her. The worn leather was scuffed from travel, its brass corners dulled with age. Everything she owned in the world fit inside that modest trunk: her clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, some keepsakes of her sister's, and the few books she couldn't bear to part with. "Good luck to you, miss." The driver tipped his hat and returned to his seat, gathering the reins. Clara watched him drive away, the coach's wheels leaving twin trails in the dusty street. She stood alone on the sidewalk, her trunk at her feet, as another gust of wind lifted her skirts and sent more dust dancing across the road. She stood near her trunk and watched the bustling afternoon activity. There were shopkeepers arranging displays, women carrying baskets of fresh bread, children chasing each other between buildings. A tall figure caught her attention. She knew without asking that it was Jack Harlow, who stood beside a wagon, his broad shoulders and commanding presence drawing her gaze. Her breath caught as she took in his rugged features and warm brown eyes that seemed to hold untold stories. Something fluttered in her chest, an unexpected spark of attraction that she quickly tamped down. This was about providing a home for young Ethan, not indulging in foolish romantic notions. She glanced around, hoping to spot the boy, but Jack stood alone. Disappointment settled in her stomach. She'd so looked forward to meeting Ethan, to beginning their relationship as mother and son. Jack dusted his hands on his pants and strode toward her with purpose. "You must be Clara Bennet," he greeted, his voice low and inviting. "Yes," Clara replied after a long pause, suddenly not sure what to say, but willing strength into her voice despite the nervous energy coursing through her. Even as he offered a welcoming smile, she sensed the weight of unspoken burdens in the slight tension around his eyes. "And you must be Jack Harlow." "I sure am, miss." He glanced at the afternoon sun. "We should get moving." Without ceremony, Jack loaded her trunk and carpetbag into the wagon. "The preacher's waiting," he said, extending his hand to help her up onto the seat. Clara accepted his assistance, trying to ignore the warmth of his calloused palm against hers. They rode in silence to the small white church at the edge of town, where Reverend Matthews waited to perform their marriage ceremony. The whole thing felt surreal. She was meeting her future husband and being married within the span of an hour, but Clara reminded herself this was a practical arrangement, nothing more. She was here to be a mother to Ethan, not to lose her heart to his father. Chapter 2. The young woman who was now Clara Harlow perched on the edge of the wagon seat, her heart racing as Jack climbed in beside her. The air crackled with unspoken words, thickening the space between them. She glanced at him, noting the way his jaw tightened as he grasped the reins. The tension hung heavy like a storm cloud waiting to burst. "Guess this is it," she ventured, trying to break the silence. Jack nodded without looking her way, his eyes focused on the trail ahead. The horses shifted beneath them, their hooves crunching against the dirt road as they set off toward his ranch. Clara shifted in her seat, seeking a topic that might bridge the gap. "What's Ethan like?" At the mention of his son's name, Jack's demeanor softened. He's quiet," he replied slowly. "Takes after his mother in that regard." A hint of sadness crept into his voice, and Clara felt a pang of empathy for him, and for Ethan. "Does he enjoy drawing?" Clara asked, remembering a sentence in one of Jack's letters that he spent a lot of time scribbling. Jack glanced at her, surprise flickering in his brown eyes, before he spoke again. "Yeah, he loves it. Spends hours with his sketchbook." A smile tugged at the corner of Jack's lips, a fleeting glimpse of joy that Clara cherished. "I can't wait to see what he's created," she said, warmth blooming in her chest at the thought of meeting Ethan. Art has a way of bringing out feelings. Jack gave her a questioning glance but didn't respond, and glanced back at the dirt road. Clara bit her lip. One of the subjects that hadn't been addressed in Jack's letter was how his wife had died. She didn't want to pry, but she also felt compelled to acknowledge what was hanging between them. But she also instinctively knew that now wasn't the time to satisfy her curiosity. "I'm excited to meet him," she said softly, hoping to soothe some of Jack's unspoken worries. "Ethan is aware that I went to pick up his new ma. He will be glad to meet you too," Jack murmured, though doubt flickered across his face momentarily before he steered them down another path lined with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. Clara's mind raced, searching for a safe topic to fill the silence that enveloped them like a heavy fog. She glanced out at the landscape rushing by, but nothing seemed fitting. Rolling hills and clusters of trees blurred into a green canvas as they traveled farther from Dusty Ridge. The scent of earth and blooming wildflowers wafted through the wagon, stirring memories of her own childhood spent playing in meadows. She could see the towering Rocky Mountains in the distance. She tightened her grip on her lap, feeling the rough fabric of her skirt. The urge to break the tension swelled inside her, but each time she opened her mouth to speak, the words slipped away like grains of sand through her fingers. Clara stole another glance at Jack. His rugged features drew her in. His strong jawline, dark brown hair catching glimmers of sunlight, and those warm brown eyes that seemed to hide layers beneath their surface. She marveled at how handsome he was. There was a magnetism about him that pulled at something deep within her. Less than an hour later, the wagon rolled to a stop outside the rustic barn, the wooden structure standing proudly against the vast expanse of fields. Clara stepped down with a sigh, glad that the mostly silent wagon ride was at its end. Jack's steady hand guided her to solid ground, and as her boots hit the earth she paused, taking in the sprawling landscape before her. Sunlight bathed the fields in golden hues, painting a picturesque scene of wild flowers and waving grasses. A few horses grazed lazily in the distance, their manes fluttering gently in the breeze. Clara inhaled deeply, allowing the scent of hay and earth to wash over her. "Goodness, it's beautiful!" she exclaimed, unable to contain her delight. Her heart swelled with warmth, a feeling long absent from her life. Jack stood beside her, a hint of pride creeping into his expression as he surveyed his land. "It ain't much compared to some places," he replied, but Clara could hear the softness in his voice as well as a fondness for what he had built despite its imperfections. "No," she shook her head, stepping further into the sunlight that seemed to embrace her like an old friend. "It's perfect." The vibrancy around her stirred something deep within. It was as if nature itself had painted a canvas just for her. She turned to Jack, her excitement suddenly bubbling over. "Can I meet Ethan now?" Jack hesitated, his expression shifting as he looked back toward the barn. "Ethan's spending the day with Roy and Martha Browning," he said slowly. "Who are they?" "Roy is my foreman, and his wife, Martha, has been taking care of Ethan during the day while I work," Jack explained. Her heart sank at the news. "He will be with them all day?" Clara's voice wavered, a hint of disappointment creeping in. She had envisioned a joyful introduction, one that would begin their new life together as a family. "Yeah," Jack replied, scratching the back of his neck. "Roy and Martha have been great in helping me out since things changed." His gaze drifted off toward the horizon, as if searching for something just out of reach. Clara nodded, though a sense of uncertainty continued to nag at her insides like a persistent whisper. Shouldn't it be important for Ethan to meet his new mother? She couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, the introduction of their new family, should be filled with joy and warmth. "Would you like me to give you a tour of the ranch?" Jack suggested, breaking through her thoughts. His voice was warm, inviting her into his world despite her longing for connection with Ethan. "I suppose I should get acquainted with my surroundings," she replied reluctantly, forcing herself to sound excited, when in reality, deep down, she suddenly wanted to cry. "Great!" Jack gestured toward the barn, and then down the trail that led toward an open field dotted with grazing horses. "Let's start there." As they walked side by side, Clara studied Jack's profile, his strong jawline set against the sun, and the determination in his stride. He moved with purpose, but allowed her to match his pace. "This is where we keep our horses," he explained as they reached the barn doors, which swung open with a creak. Inside stood several stalls filled with gentle-eyed animals. Clara's heart lifted at their beauty. She reached out to stroke one horse's nose. Its warmth soothed something within her. Jack watched her closely, admiration flickering across his features. "They know how to sense a good soul," he commented softly. "Maybe I'll have time to ride soon?" Clara suggested, glancing up at him through her lashes. "If you'd like." He smiled again, a genuine expression that ignited hope within her despite her earlier disappointment. Clara marveled at the ranch's expanse as Jack led her through the open fields. The air was alive with the scent of grass and wildflowers, and the gentle rustling of leaves provided a soft melody in the background. She soaked in every detail, the way sunlight kissed the earth, how shadows danced beneath the trees, and the distant whinny of horses. "Over here is where we keep the hay," Jack pointed out, gesturing toward a tall stack that seemed to touch the sky. "We go through quite a bit during winter." "It looks impressive," Clara replied, genuinely impressed. The way he spoke about his work revealed layers of dedication that resonated with her nurturing spirit. As they walked further, she admired the sturdy wooden fences lining the property. Jack shared stories about training horses and maintaining the ranch's operations, his voice steady but warm, and Clara found herself captivated by his passion. "Those are our fields for barley and oats," he said, indicating an area that stretched out like a green carpet. "In a few months, they'll be ready for harvest." "I've never seen crops grow like this before," she admitted. "It's beautiful." Jack glanced sideways at her, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You'll get used to it. Just takes time." With each step deeper into his world, Clara felt her heart flutter with anticipation for what lay ahead, each moment revealing a piece of Jack she hadn't known before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity filled with laughter and easy conversation, Jack turned toward a small log home nestled among trees at the edge of the property. The house exuded charm with its rustic appearance, smoky chimney rising against blue skies, and flowers blooming in front, as if welcoming her. "This is home," he said quietly, motioning toward it with a slight smile that softened his rugged features. Clara's breath caught as they approached. Something about its simplicity struck a chord within her. It felt inviting yet grounded, a place where memories could take root. "It's lovely," she murmured as they stepped onto the porch made from worn wooden planks that creaked underfoot. Jack opened the door, revealing a cozy interior filled with sunlight streaming through wide windows. A sense of warmth enveloped her immediately, the kind that whispered promises of family dinners and laughter echoing within these walls. A fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth lined with neatly stacked firewood. Pictures adorned the other walls. Some were faded photographs of a woman Clara guessed must be Ethan's mother, while others captured moments of joy between Jack and his son. "This is where we spend our evenings," Jack explained, gesturing around the cozy living area. The cabin had 3 bedrooms branching off from a central hallway. Clara's gaze flitted from one door to another. One room clearly belonged to a little boy. It was filled with drawings taped to the walls and toys scattered across the floor. Another room had simple furnishings but carried an unmistakable sense of care that resonated with Clara's heart. "This one can be yours," Jack said as he opened the door to what appeared to be a guest room. Light streamed in through a small window, illuminating soft linens on the bed and a dresser adorned with flowers. "Thank you," Clara replied sincerely, feeling gratitude swell within her. She hadn't been sure if Jack was expecting her to share his bed right away, but it seemed like he was willing to give her some time to get used to their new situation. "I've got chores to attend to before nightfall," Jack stated, glancing out toward the horizon where colors began blending into shades of red and purple. "Of course," Clara replied softly as she took in the serene surroundings once more. After he left for his tasks, she moved into her new setting and began unpacking her belongings. A few dresses folded neatly alongside her sketchbook and paints. This guest room offered her comfort but also space. and a chance to know Jack better before intertwining their lives too closely, if that would ever happen. Chapter 3. Morning light spilled through the small window, casting warm beams across Clara's room. She squinted against the brightness, momentarily blinded before her eyes adjusted to the gentle glow. The patchwork quilt draped over the bed radiated comfort, its colorful patterns reminding her of childhood days spent stitching with her mother. Bird calls filled the air, a sweet serenade that stirred excitement within Clara. Today, however, would be different. Clara pulled on a crisp linen blouse, its fabric cool against her skin. As she fastened the buttons, her fingers trembled slightly. "Today I'll meet Jack's boy," she whispered to herself, determination threading through her voice. The thought sent both thrills and nerves racing through her chest. My son. With a quick glance in the small mirror on the wall, she surveyed her reflection. Long waves of auburn hair cascaded down to frame her freckled cheeks. She gathered it into a loose bun atop her head, fingers deftly tucking stray strands into place. She hoped to project an image of calm confidence as she prepared for their encounter. Clara stepped into the cozy kitchen, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee in the air. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating Jack as he stood at the stove, expertly frying strips of bacon. The sizzling sound mingled with the quiet clinking of pans, creating a rhythm that filled the air. "Morning, Clara," Jack greeted without glancing back, his voice gruff yet familiar. The simple word felt heavy with unspoken tension, lingering like steam from the bubbling pot nearby. "Good morning," Clara replied, her heart fluttering with uncertainty. She moved to the small table, its wooden surface polished but scratched in places, showing marks of life and love. As she set out plates and utensils, her thoughts swirled like leaves in a brisk wind. Jack turned to face her briefly, his warm brown eyes catching hers before returning to the task at hand. The way he concentrated on cooking revealed a man who found solace in routine, yet Clara sensed an underlying layer of concern buried beneath his steady demeanor. "Hope you're hungry," he added as he placed the bacon on a plate and reached for a stack of pancakes. "I could eat." She forced a smile, hoping it would ease the tension thickening in the room. Clara's mind raced as she helped set the table. How would she approach Jack's son? Would he welcome her presence or shy away? The thought weighed heavily on her chest, threatening to squeeze all hope from her resolve. "Jack," she ventured cautiously, pausing as he poured syrup over a pile of pancakes, "I'd like to take over making meals from now on." He turned at that, brow slightly raised. "You sure about that?" His tone held a hint of surprise mixed with concern. "I am." Her voice softened but remained firm. "I think it'll be good for both of us. For your son, too." Jack nodded slowly, contemplation furrowing his brow momentarily, before his expression relaxed into agreement. Clara felt a rush of relief wash over her. Perhaps this was a step toward forging connections with both him and his child. "All right then," he replied after a beat, turning back to finish breakfast as Clara busied herself with placing napkins beside each plate. "Will Ethan be joining us for breakfast?" Clara asked, doing her best to sound nonchalant. Jack shook his head. "He'll eat with Martha and Roy, and then Roy will bring him to the barn for morning chores. I'll take you to meet him when we are done eating." "I'm looking forward to it," Clara answered with a smile. After breakfast, Clara's heart raced as Jack led her through the sunlit yard toward the barn. Each step felt like a leap into the unknown, and she focused on the rhythm of her breath to steady herself. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its weathered boards telling tales of time and toil. As they approached, Clara's pulse quickened. She caught sight of a small figure hunched in a dusty corner, sketching diligently in a tattered book. The sandy-haired boy barely stirred, his focus unwavering as he poured himself into his art. "Ethan, this is Clara, your new mother," Jack announced, his voice echoing softly within the barn's confines. Clara's breath caught at the sight of him. Ethan's big blue eyes flickered up momentarily, reflecting not only Jack's color but also an ocean of sorrow that seemed far beyond his 8 years. A moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. He returned to his drawing without a hint of acknowledgement, dismissing both adults with an air of what seemed to be practiced indifference. Clara felt a pang in her heart. Even though she hadn't expected Ethan to run into her arms the moment they met, she had hoped for more of a reaction. Jack shifted beside her, glancing down at Ethan with a mixture of pride and concern. Clara noted the way Jack's lips pressed together tightly. "Mind if I take a look?" Clara ventured gently, inching closer to Ethan without encroaching upon his space. Ethan remained absorbed in his work, pencil scratching against paper with intensity. He seemed lost in his own world of a landscape populated by creatures only he could see. Clara knelt beside him and peeked over at the drawings taking shape on the page. Vibrant flowers and animals crafted with remarkable detail that spoke volumes about his imagination. He drew quite well for a child his age. "Those are beautiful," she murmured, genuine admiration slipping into her tone. For a brief moment Ethan paused, eyes darting toward her but then quickly shifting back to his sketchbook. His lips pressed into a thin line. He seemed unsure whether to respond or retreat further behind the walls he had built around himself. Jack stepped closer but remained silent. It was clear he understood that Ethan needed space to navigate this new dynamic on his own terms. Clara held her breath as she tried to gauge Ethan's mood through fleeting glances and subtle shifts in posture. She leaned closer to Ethan, trying to catch a glimpse of the world he created with each stroke of his pencil. "Do you like drawing animals?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's hand moved steadily, the tip of the pencil dancing across the page, but he didn't respond. Clara's heart sank a little more. She glanced at Jack, hoping for a sign that this was normal behavior for the boy. Jack stood beside them, arms crossed, his expression troubled. He let out a heavy sigh that echoed through the barn's quiet corners. "I supposed that I should tell you. He hasn't spoken a word since—" Jack hesitated, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Since his mother died." Clara blinked in surprise, her heart lurching at the revelation. A wave of sympathy washed over her as she took in Jack's solemn expression and Ethan's downcast gaze. "Oh," she breathed, grappling with the sudden understanding that washed over her like cold water. The letters exchanged between her and Jack had been filled with hope for a new beginning, but never hinted at such deep sorrow. Why hadn't Ethan mentioned this? She could have prepared herself better if only he'd shared something so significant in their correspondence. Clara watched Ethan intently as he hunched further over his drawing, completely absorbed in a world that seemed unreachable to anyone else around him. The boy carried burdens she could not fathom, yet felt drawn to alleviate somehow. "You know," she began, her voice warm with nostalgia, "I like to draw too." She remembered sitting on grassy hills as a child, the scent of wildflowers wafting through the air as she let her imagination soar across the blank pages. "When I was young, I would imagine whole worlds with every stroke," she continued, her gaze steady on him. She searched for a spark of interest in his expression, hoping he might feel the same pull towards creativity that once ignited her own spirit. Ethan remained silent, his attention firmly fixed on his sketchbook. Clara studied him, how his sandy hair fell across his forehead, and how his small fingers gripped the pencil with fierce determination. The effort it took for him to shield his art from view was evident. "Drawing is like telling stories without words," she encouraged softly. "Each picture can carry so much meaning." Jack leaned against the barn doorframe, arms crossed over his chest as he watched Clara work her magic. He admired how she tried to connect with Ethan in ways that words could not reach. It reminded him of their first encounter the day before, her warmth igniting something inside him that had long been dormant. Clara remained undeterred by Ethan's reluctance. She leaned closer, dropping her voice to a whisper as if sharing a secret meant only for them. "I have some colored pencils in my trunk. Would you like to see them?" Ethan hesitated, his blue eyes flickering up to meet hers for a moment before he nodded slowly. Clara felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension as she stood up and extended her hand toward him. "Come on then," she urged gently, leading the way out of the barn and toward the house. The warm sun poured down upon them, casting long shadows on the ground as Jack trailed behind discreetly, keeping a watchful eye. Once inside the house, Clara opened the door to her room and stepped inside, glancing back to ensure Ethan followed. She felt Jack's presence, but she ignored him and knelt beside her trunk, flipping it open with a soft creak. The trunk revealed an assortment of belongings that she had decided not to unpack. She reached under a folded dress and lifted out a metal tin. "I used these when I was younger," Clara shared, her voice tinged with nostalgia as she placed the pencil set beside her own sketchbook on the bed. "They always brought my drawings to life." Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the colorful array spread before him, shades of red, blue, green, and yellow, waiting patiently for someone to breathe life into them. Clara watched as he stared at the pencils with a mixture of awe and hesitation. "Go ahead," she encouraged softly, nudging one of the pencils closer to him. "You can try them out." After a long moment of contemplation, Ethan reached out and picked up a vibrant blue pencil. His small fingers gripped it tightly as he turned back to his sketchbook. With slow precision, he pressed the tip against the page. Clara felt hope flutter within her chest as she observed him drawing again. The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly with each stroke he made. As Ethan lost himself in the colors and shapes on the page, Clara felt a quiet joy swell within her. She couldn't help but admire how his fingers moved with precision, transforming the blank canvas into a vibrant landscape of imagination. But as she turned her attention to Jack, a flicker of uncertainty gripped her heart. Jack stood by the door, arms crossed, an unreadable expression shadowing his handsome features. His brown eyes held a mix of emotions, concern, hope, and something deeper that Clara couldn't quite decipher. "You can use any colored pencil you wish." Ethan glanced up briefly at her, a small smile creeping onto his face before he returned to his drawing. Satisfied that he had the freedom to create, Clara decided she needed some air to clear her thoughts. Leaving her room, she stepped outside onto the porch. The sounds of nature swirled around her. The rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds filled the serene space. It was beautiful here, yet her heart remained heavy. What had happened to make Ethan not want to talk? Jack followed her out but stood back at the threshold, watching as if unsure whether to join her or remain in the shadows. Clara felt an urge to reach out but held back. "Why didn't you tell me Ethan doesn't talk?" Clara asked finally, breaking through the silence that stretched between them like an unyielding barrier. "I hoped he would start talking with your arrival." Jack's voice was low and cautious, his gaze fixed on something far beyond their immediate surroundings. Clara stifled a wry laugh. "Well, that obviously didn't happen. I'm assuming he has spoken in the past, but why isn't he talking now?" Clara pressed gently. She wanted answers, but could see Jack's reluctance to delve into painful territory. He shifted slightly, discomfort rippling across his strong features. "I need to check on the cattle," he said instead, turning toward the horizon where fields stretched endlessly. Clara felt disappointment bloom within her, but knew pushing wouldn't help. Jack had retreated into himself again. "All right," she murmured softly as he walked away, feeling uncertain yet resolute about what lay ahead for all of them. Clara watched Jack stride away, his tall figure growing smaller against the vast expanse of the ranch. A sense of discouragement settled over her, heavy and suffocating. She felt like an outsider in a place that promised new beginnings, but echoed with unspoken sorrows. Taking a deep breath, Clara turned her gaze to the sprawling fields dotted with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. The mountains stood proud in the distance, their majesty a stark contrast to the turmoil she sensed within this family. She hoped she could bridge the gaps between them, that she might be able to reach Ethan and somehow pull Jack from his shadows. The thought of her own family's loss gripped her heart like a vice. Memories of laughter and warmth faded into echoes of silence, reminding her how quickly joy could turn into grief. They had always been her safe haven, yet circumstances had ripped them away. She understood loss too well. Perhaps that made her more determined to help Ethan and Jack through their own darkness. She hesitated for a moment longer before deciding to check on Ethan. As she turned toward the door, movement caught her eye. Jack stood in the distance with an older man. He was weathered and rugged with silver streaks in his hair, and he was waving his hands around wildly. Clara's curiosity piqued as she noticed their body language. Jack's stance was tense while the man's gestures were animated and almost aggressive. A frown creased Clara's brow as she squinted to catch snippets of their conversation. The man's voice carried faintly on the wind, sharp words cutting through the air between them like daggers. Who was he? Clara wondered, unease creeping into her chest. It was clear they weren't just exchanging pleasantries. Something deeper lay beneath their exchange. Chapter 4. Early the next morning, Clara stood at the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded the soft dough for biscuits. The air felt thick and heavy with anticipation, the scent of rain mingling with the warm aroma of bread. She glanced over at Ethan, who sat hunched at the table, his sketchbook open but untouched. His sandy blonde hair fell over his eyes, and Clara sensed he had retreated into his own world again. "Ethan?" she called softly, hoping to draw him out. No response came. Fingers working rhythmically through the dough, Clara fought against a swell of concern. She longed to reach him, to coax him into conversation, but she knew she needed to be patient. The creak of the door announced Jack's arrival. He strode in wearing his sturdy brown shirt and worn jeans, ready for another day on the ranch. A hint of warmth lit up his face as he caught Clara's eye. "Looks like a storm's rollin' in," he remarked, glancing out the window at the brooding clouds gathering overhead. "Maybe it'll be a good day to stay in and draw." Clara forced a cheerful tone as she glanced at Ethan, who showed no response to the adults in the cozy kitchen. Jack approached her side, leaning against the counter as he surveyed her work. "I love biscuits," he said with genuine appreciation. "Those looked good. When I tried to make biscuits, they turned out hard as rocks. The recipe for these comes from my grandmother." Jack ruffled Ethan's hair as he walked by the table, and Clara's heart skipped a beat as the boy gave his father a smile before returning to being lost in his own imagination. Clara wiped her hands on a towel and moved closer to Ethan. "What are you drawing today?" she asked gently, peering over his shoulder. He shifted slightly, but didn't respond. His pencil hovered above the page without movement. With a sigh, she returned to finish making the biscuits. The next few minutes were spent cooking the biscuits and finishing breakfast. 20 minutes later, Clara set the last biscuit on the table, satisfied with the way breakfast had come together. Jack said a simple prayer over the steaming plates of biscuits, eggs, and bacon. Clara bowed her head, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. As they filled their plates, Clara's thoughts drifted to meals with her sisters. Laughter had filled those spaces, chatter about crushes and gossip from town, the lively debates that often ended in playful arguments. Here, silence wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. She glanced at Ethan, who poked at his food with a fork, his blue eyes focused on anything but the plate in front of him. Jack cut into his biscuit, a steady rhythm to his movements that felt both reassuring and foreign. Clara forced herself to concentrate on her meal instead of dwelling on memories she couldn't change. Just as they finished, a sharp knock echoed through the kitchen. Jack stood, brushing crumbs from his hands before crossing to the door. "Come on in," he called, swinging it open to reveal an older couple standing on the porch. Clara instinctively straightened, smoothing her apron as she prepared to greet them. "This is Roy and Martha Browning," Jack introduced them, stepping aside to let them enter. Roy strode in with a firm gait, his stocky frame commanding attention. Martha followed more cautiously, her eyes narrowing slightly as they met Clara's. "Good morning," Clara said warmly, extending a hand. "It's lovely to meet you both." Martha accepted the handshake but barely returned Clara's smile. "Must be nice to have settled here," she remarked coolly, eyeing Clara with a hint of disdain. "Though I reckon you must be desperate to answer an ad like that." Jack shifted uncomfortably at the comment. "Now, Martha, it's true." Her voice dripped with condescension. "A woman willing to uproot herself for a man she barely knows? It speaks volumes." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her composure. "I'm looking for stability just like anyone else," she replied evenly. Ethan stirred at the table but didn't look up from his drawing. Martha's gaze flicked toward him before returning sharply to Clara. "Ethan needs stability, not uncertain changes." Clara's heart sank at the words. She sensed judgment lurking beneath them like a shadow threatening to engulf the moment. She glanced at Ethan, who gave Martha a look of disapproval. "I believe love offers the best kind of stability," Clara countered gently, meeting Martha's gaze directly. A heavy silence descended around the table. Roy shifted his weight and cleared his throat, while Jack frowned slightly. It was then Clara realized she had more to deal with besides Ethan's silence. Here stood an older couple who seemed to resent her presence. Martha folded her arms tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable. "Ethan is used to spending his days with me," Martha declared, her tone leaving no room for disagreement. "I'll take him with me. That way you can settle in here without any distractions." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but the words lodged in her throat. "I'd really like to spend time with Ethan," she finally managed, her voice steady despite the uncertainty knotting in her stomach. "It would help me get to know him better, and he is definitely not a distraction." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, and Clara felt as if she were standing before a wall, unyielding and cold. She glanced at Jack and hoped that he would put an end to Martha's plans, but he only looked at Ethan. "You can go with Martha, son, if you'd like." Clara watched as Ethan slowly stood up and walked to Martha's side. She also noticed that he left his sketchbook at the table. She was about to hand him the small book, but Martha took his arm and pulled him outside. Clara's chest tightened at the sight of them disappearing into the morning light. She turned to Jack, hoping for some sign of support from him, something that would counter Martha's domineering presence, but his shoulders sagged slightly as he faced her. "Guess I'll start on my list of chores," Roy announced from behind Jack. His voice broke through Clara's thoughts like a clap of thunder. Jack nodded at Roy's words, but didn't look away from Clara. The silence hung heavy between them, as if he were weighing options or trying to find a way through uncharted territory. Roy left the kitchen mumbling under his breath, something about there being too many changes around the ranch, that a man couldn't catch his breath. Clara wiped her hands on the towel again, her heart racing with frustration. "Jack, I'm not happy Marta took Ethan for the day," she said, her voice firm despite the knot in her stomach. She instinctively knew if she didn't say anything, what she had just witnessed would become a repeat each morning. "They're just looking out for him," Jack replied, his brow furrowing slightly. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "They've helped me out a lot since my wife's death. I couldn't have made it without Martha keeping an eye out for Ethan and Roy's expertise with ranch work. I'm glad that you have had their help and support, but isn't that why you asked me to marry you, to be a mother to Ethan?" Suddenly the first raindrops splattered against the window, a soft patter that quickly intensified into a furious downpour. The sound grew louder, mirroring the tension crackling between them. Jack lifted a hand and ran it through his sandy hair. "You've already made a difference with him, surely you know that." Clara's heart softened at his words. She could see that Jack was feeling pulled in many directions. "You need to trust me and let me do what I feel is best." Jack remained silent for a moment, his warm brown eyes studying her intently. Clara felt exposed under his gaze, but she held her ground. Loud thunder echoed in the distance, and the air thickened with unspoken words. Finally he broke the silence. "I reckon that you're right. I'll bring Ethan back after the storm blows over." Relief washed over her like a warm tide. Their partnership began to take shape amidst their differences. True to his word, as soon as the rain began to fade, Jack brought Ethan back to the house. He smiled at her and then disappeared out the door again. Ethan didn't glance at her, but immediately went back to the kitchen table and began to carefully draw what looked like a tree. Even though Jack hadn't spoken a word to Clara, she sensed something shifting between them. It was as if they both grasped at something more than just an obligation or arrangement. They were beginning to force a bond of trust that could weather any storm. After lunch, Clara wiped her hands on her apron, still feeling anxiety as she tidied the kitchen. The storm has moved on, leaving the afternoon sun to pour through the window. Warm rays cast across the table where Ethan's drawings lay scattered. Just then a knock echoed through the home, startling her from her thoughts. "Visitors," Clara called, glancing toward the door. Her heart raced at the prospect of meeting new faces, an opportunity to build connections in this unfamiliar place. Jack stepped out to greet them, and moments later Calvin and Anna Hawthorne entered with broad smiles. Anna's curly hair bounced as she stepped into the light, radiating warmth that immediately enveloped Clara. Welcome to our little corner of the world, Anna exclaimed, her hazel eyes sparkling with genuine kindness. I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. Not at all, Clara replied, relief washing over her. It's wonderful to meet you. Clara stepped aside as Ethan welcomed the newcomers into the warmth of the kitchen. The woman's laughter rang like a bell, filling the room with an unexpected lightness that put Clara at ease. I'm Anna Hawthorne, she said, her hazel eyes sparkling with warmth. And this is my husband, Calvin. She gestured to the man beside her, who offered a nod and a friendly smile. A little girl stood close to Anna, her hair dancing in soft waves, mirroring her mother's vibrant spirit. Hi, I'm Sarah, the girl chimed, her voice bright and cheerful as she bounced on her toes. Clara couldn't help but smile back at the girl's infectious enthusiasm. It's so lovely to meet you all, Clara replied, feeling an immediate connection with Anna's buoyant energy. I just arrived a few days ago. Oh, we've been eager to meet Jack's new wife. I heard he finally settled down, Anna said with a playful wink. I wanted to bring over some treats from our place, a little welcome basket to help you feel at home. Calvin chuckled softly beside her. She gets excited about these things. Clara laughed lightly, feeling a flutter of gratitude toward Anna for her thoughtfulness. That's so sweet of you. I've been trying my hand at baking myself. Baking? You're brave, Anna teased playfully as she leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. You'll have to share your secrets, because I could use all the help I can get. Calvin offered a friendly nod before excusing himself, heading out to find Jack and lend a hand around the ranch. Clara felt the tension in her shoulders ease as soon as he stepped through the door, the weight of Martha's earlier remarks lifting slightly with his departure. Anna settled into the kitchen with an animated flourish, her energy infectious. So, tell me about your baking adventures. I can't get enough of flour and sugar. My husband swears I bake too much, but you can never have enough treats around. Clara chuckled, her heart warming at Anna's enthusiasm. I've been experimenting with biscuits and pies. I think my last batch of biscuits turned out well. At least Ethan seemed to enjoy them. Ethan is a good judge, Anna replied, rolling her eyes playfully. That boy knows what he likes, and doesn't hesitate to let you know if it's not up to par. The thought made Clara smile. She appreciated how effortlessly Anna shifted the atmosphere from tense to lively. As they spoke about their favorite recipes and baking techniques, Clara felt herself relax further into the moment. Anna's laughter filled the room like sunlight spilling through the windows. I can teach you my secret to flaky pie crust, Anna said, leaning closer as if sharing a precious treasure. It's all in keeping your butter cold. Clara nodded eagerly, eager for any wisdom she could gather. I'd love that. I've been too nervous to try pies yet. I'm afraid I'll mess it up. Don't worry about messing up, Anna encouraged with a wink. Even if it doesn't turn out perfectly, you'll still have something delicious to eat. They continued trading stories about their culinary triumphs and mishaps while Clara prepared coffee for them both. The aroma drifted through the kitchen, mingling pleasantly with the scents of baked goods. Clara watched as Sarah and Ethan settled at the kitchen table, the sunlight spilling in through the window and illuminating their little corner of the world. While Ethan sat quietly, his focus intent on the drawing in front of him, Sarah filled the air with a steady stream of chatter that seemed to dance around them both. What colors do you like best? Sarah asked, her voice light and breezy. She picked up a bright blue crayon and began filling in a wide swath of her own paper. I love blue, it's like the sky. Ethan glanced up briefly, a small smile breaking through his usual shyness. Clara felt a swell of warmth in her chest as she witnessed this simple exchange. Sarah didn't seem to mind that Ethan rarely spoke. She effortlessly bridged the silence with her animated stories and laughter, allowing Ethan to respond with smiles or quiet nods instead. Do you think we can make our drawings come to life? Sarah continued, oblivious to any hesitance from Ethan. I wish I could color my horse and ride off into a magical forest. Ethan's sandy hair fell into his eyes as he concentrated on his own picture, a colorful fort surrounded by trees. Clara leaned against the counter, marveling at how effortlessly Sarah pulled Ethan into her imaginative world, without pressure or expectations. After several moments filled with colorful scribbles and giggles, Sarah suddenly sat back, hands on her hips. "Okay, time for a game." She clapped her hands together enthusiastically. "Let's go outside for tag." After Ethan and Sarah ran outside, Clara began to slice vegetables for dinner. An idea sparked in her mind. "Would you like to join us for dinner tonight?" Anna's eyes brightened with enthusiasm. "I'd love that. What are you making?" "Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans," Clara answered with pride. Jack mentioned how much he enjoys fried chicken. "That happens to be Calvin's favorite too," Anna said, clapping her hands together lightly. "I help you out?" The two women set to work side by side, their movements fluid and natural as they shared stories about their lives. Anna recounting tales from her own childhood, while Clara opened up about her struggles. Clara wanted to ask Anna why Ethan wouldn't talk, but she hesitated. Something told her this wasn't information to gather from anyone other than Jack himself. Perhaps it was best left until later, when they could discuss it in private. Outside, laughter rang out as Ethan and Sarah continued their game of tag. Clara stole glances through the window. His face flushed with excitement, and felt hope bloom within her chest again. He might not speak yet, but today seemed like a step forward in finding joy amidst uncertainty. Chapter 5. Clara set the table with care, placing each dish just so, hoping to create an inviting atmosphere for her guests, which included the aroma of fried chicken mingled with the scents of freshly mashed potatoes and green beans. But as she heard a firm knock at the door, her heart sank when she heard familiar voices. Martha and Roy had arrived. The couple stepped inside with an air of authority. "Evening," Roy grunted, his eyes scanning the spread on the table with a critical gaze. Martha swept into the room behind him, her expression set in a tight smile that barely reached her eyes. "We hope you don't mind us dropping by for dinner," she said, though it felt more like an assertion than an inquiry. Jack stood at Clara's side, his demeanor shifting slightly as he welcomed them in. She realized then how deeply entwined Martha and Roy were in Jack's life and Ethan's, a realization that weighed heavily on her. Clara forced a welcoming smile as she motioned for everyone to take their seats. As they settled around the table, she sensed Martha's sharp gaze assessing everything from the arrangement of food to Clara herself. The atmosphere thickened under Martha's scrutiny. Every bite taken felt scrutinized like an audition. She needed them on her side if she was going to build any kind of future here, not just for herself but for Ethan too. How could she break through their defenses? Jack asked Sarah to give the blessing on the food. The moment the amen was said, Clara encouraged everyone to fill their plates. Even though she would have preferred that Martha and Roy weren't there, she was glad she had made enough food for everyone. She began to relax as everyone dug into the meal. Laughter echoed around the table as Jack shared a humorous story about a wayward cow, eliciting chuckles from Anna and Calvin. Even Ethan smiled as Sarah animatedly told her own story about finding kittens in their barn, her hands flying through the air. "This chicken is delicious," Calvin said as he took a second piece. Clara was about to thank him when Marta's voice sliced through the air. "I just hope Clara's presence isn't a fleeting fancy," she stated, her tone laced with skepticism. Clara's stomach dropped. The laughter faded into an uneasy silence that hung over them. It was obvious that Martha's words had created a thick tension. Jack shifted uncomfortably beside her. She swallowed hard, determination flooding her eyes as she met Martha's gaze. "I'm here for the long haul, Martha." The words hung in the air, charged with challenge. Clara sensed everyone at the table drawing back slightly. Calvin and Anna exchanged glances, their expressions revealing concern, while Sarah clutched Ethan's arm tighter. Martha's expression hardened but remained inscrutable. Clara couldn't tell if she'd struck a nerve or merely drawn further ire. Jack's hand brushed against Clara's, a small gesture but one that sent warmth flooding through her. She glanced at him and found his brown eyes steady on hers, filled with an understanding that bolstered her resolve. "I know you care for Ethan," Clara continued, her voice firmer now as she focused on Martha, "and I respect your role in his life." She let those words linger for a moment before adding softly, "But I want to be part of his future too." Clara felt the weight of silence enveloping the room after Martha's remark. Jack's sharp look pierced through the tension, his expression fierce enough to make even Martha pause. For a moment, it seemed as though he had managed to shield Clara from further attack. "I don't regret bringing Clara into our lives," Jack stated firmly, his voice steady as he met each gaze around the table. His warmth wrapped around Clara like a protective barrier, pushing back against the chill that Martha's words had summoned. Clara's heart fluttered with gratitude, but even as relief washed over her, the dark look that shot Clara's way made it clear this battle wasn't over. It was merely postponed. The meal continued in strained silence, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and occasional forced laughter from Sarah as she attempted to lighten the mood. Clara picked at her food, acutely aware of the shifting dynamics at play. Her mind raced, replaying Jack's words while contemplating what they truly meant for her future here. When Anna finally announced that it was time for them to leave, Clara was saddened. She had enjoyed their company immensely, grateful for Anna's new friendship and Calvin's easy camaraderie. "Thank you for dinner," Anna said warmly as she stood up with Sarah and Calvin in tow. "It will be our turn to invite you for dinner in a few weeks." Clara offered a genuine smile in response, but felt a pang of loss settle in her chest as they stepped toward the door. Once they left, Roy rose slowly from his seat, exchanging a glance with Martha that sent an uneasy shiver down Clara's spine. The couple made their way toward the door with deliberate slowness. As they crossed into the fading light outside, Martha paused just long enough to shoot one last glare at Clara. "I'll be keeping an eye on you," Martha stated softly before turning away without another word. With that, Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She hurried to the kitchen and began to wash the dishes. She could hear Jack talk to Ethan as he put him to bed. She focused on scrubbing the plates, her mind replaying Martha's words like a bitter refrain. "Clara?" Jack's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She glanced over to see him stepping toward her, towel in hand, a rare softness settling in his expression. "I can handle this," she said, attempting to sound resolute as she rinsed another plate. "Let me help." He moved to her side, rolling up his sleeves with an ease that made Clara's heart flutter unexpectedly. They worked in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. The clinking of dishes provided a rhythmic backdrop to their quiet companionship. Clara couldn't help but steal glances at Jack as he wiped down the counters with methodical precision. Finally, he turned to her, his expression serious. "You didn't deserve that," he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper as he wiped his hands on the towel. "I don't know what has come over Martha and Roy. They have always been outspoken, but they have never been outright rude to someone before." Clara shook her head, feeling the weight of that conversation settle heavily on her shoulders. "To them, I'm the outsider." "No, Clara." His tone shifted. It was firmer now as he leaned closer. "You're not just the outsider, you are part of the family." His gaze locked onto hers, an unspoken understanding solidifying between them. Clara's heart raced at the sincerity she saw reflected back at her in his warm brown eyes. The air around them thickened with connection as they stood there, together yet separate, each caught in the delicate moment suspended between what had been said and what lay ahead. Chapter 6. Clara stood on the porch, her apron dusted with flour from breakfast. The scent of freshly baked biscuits still lingered in the air, but it was the vastness of the world around her that captivated her attention. She gazed at the nearby rugged mountains, their peaks kissed by morning sunlight while tendrils of mist curled and danced away, like shy spirits retreating into the earth. Ethan sat nearby, clutching his sketchbook, his sandy blonde hair catching the light as he tilted his head down to concentrate on his drawings. Clara's heart fluttered with excitement. Today marked a new opportunity, a chance to coax Ethan out of his shell and explore the beauty that lay beyond their ranch. It will be a good idea to get off the ranch for a while, she thought, determination coursing through her veins. The vibrant colors of wildflowers beckoned her. She envisioned Ethan's blue eyes lighting up as he discovered nature's secrets alongside her. With renewed energy, Clara stepped inside. He leaned against the kitchen counter, casually sharpening a knife, unaware of the plans blossoming in her mind. "Jack," she began, trying to keep her voice steady despite the excitement bubbling within her. "I think it would be fun to go on a hike into the mountains today." His warm brown eyes flicked up to meet hers. "A hike?" He straightened slightly, curiosity evident on his face. Yes, I think it could help Ethan. Clara's heart raced as she explained her vision. A stroll through fields bursting with color and trees standing tall like guardians of old secrets. He needs a chance to connect with something outside himself. Jack considered her words carefully, setting down the knife. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. That sounds good. It's been a while since I've taken a day off. A smile broke across Clara's face. She hadn't expected Jack to agree to come with them. You'll come with us? Of course. His voice held warmth and reassurance that sent a rush of relief through Clara. Let me put together a picnic lunch, she said, before slipping back outside to find Ethan just where she had left him. She crouched down, her auburn hair spilling around her face. Ethan, how would you like to go on an adventure? He looked up at her, uncertainty shadowing his features. She noticed how he hesitated, his small hands clutching the edges of his sketchbook. We can explore the creek and find new things for you to draw, she added, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Clara held her breath, willing him to see the fun waiting just beyond their front porch. Ethan's gaze flicked toward Jack, who had followed her, as if searching for reassurance. Your father will come too, Clara said, injecting enthusiasm into her words. Jack nodded in agreement from behind them. It'll be fun, he said, a hint of encouragement lacing his tone. After a moment that felt stretched thin with anticipation, Ethan's expression softened, a flicker of curiosity ignited in his blue eyes as he nodded slowly. Clara packed the picnic basket with care. Beef sandwiches neatly wrapped in cloth, fresh apples, and a few cookies for a sweet touch. She added a jar of water just as the door opened. Jack stepped inside, his broad shoulders blocking the sunlight momentarily. Ethan's blue eyes sparkled with curiosity as he peered into the basket. Are you two ready to go? Clara asked, her heart fluttering with anticipation. With Jack leading the way, they stepped onto the dirt path that wound away from the ranch. Clara felt her spirit lift with every step they took through the lush grass. However, her gaze drifted toward a small house as they passed. Marta stood on the porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest, and a frown etched deep into her features. Ethan gave Marta a short wave and then ran ahead of them. Clara sensed the weight of Marta's disapproval but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the path ahead. The rustling leaves blew in the breeze, birds chirped in the air above them, their songs weaving through the air like ribbons of sound. Clara breathed deeply, inhaling the fresh scent of earth and blooming flowers that danced around them. Look at that! Clara exclaimed suddenly, kneeling beside a cluster of daisies bursting through the underbrush. The delicate petals shimmered in hues of white and yellow under dappled sunlight. She carefully picked one flower and held it up to Ethan's curious gaze. This is the color of happiness, she said softly, watching his expression change as he took in her words. Ethan's eyes softened at the sight of the daisy. A flicker of amusement touched his lips as if Clara had just shared a delightful secret. Art can express all the emotions we have inside, she continued, feeling a swell of hope as she spoke. Jack leaned against a nearby tree trunk, watching them both with an appreciative smile. Her heart swelled with joy and freedom as they strolled further along a nearby creek. The gentle babble of water gliding over stones created a symphony that matched her rising spirits. Without thinking, she twirled on her heels, letting her long auburn hair fly around her like a curtain of fire. Catch me if you can, she called out, her laughter ringing through the crisp air like a melody. Jack chuckled, his deep voice rolling through the trees as he took off after her. Clara darted away, reveling in the sheer delight of the moment. She hopped from one rock to another, feeling as light as a feather, while the world faded into the background. Hey, no fair, Jack shouted, laughter threading through his words as he tried to close the distance between them. Ethan trailed behind, watching with wide blue eyes that sparkled like the creek under sunlight. Clara caught sight of him, and her heart danced at the flicker of amusement playing across his face. She spun back toward him and waved. Join us, she encouraged, spreading her arms wide. It's more fun with three. A small smile broke through Ethan's initial hesitance. He took a cautious step forward but then paused again, uncertain. Come on, Clara laughed again, feeling an irresistible urge to coax him into this world of light-heartedness. I promise I won't bite. With an unexpected burst of courage, Ethan jumped onto a nearby rock and began to bounce lightly, mimicking Clara's movements. That's it, she cheered, just like that. As Clara twirled once more and then fell into an exaggerated dip as if performing for an audience only they could see, Jack joined in with his own playful flair, leaping and spinning in ways that surprised Clara of a rugged rancher. Ethan's laughter bubbled forth unexpectedly. It was music, a sound so pure it melted something inside Clara's chest. Their smiles intertwined under the canopy of leaves above them. Jack stared at his son. I haven't heard him laugh for a long time. Clara placed a hand on his arm before settling under a large shade tree and its swaying branches. She opened her sketchbook and ran a hand over an empty page. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting playful patterns on the page. She glanced at Ethan, who stood a few feet away, his blue eyes wide with curiosity as he looked at her. Come and join me. Why don't you try drawing what you see, Clara suggested as she patted the ground beside her. Imagine what colors you see in your mind. With a deep breath, Ethan finally reached for a piece of charcoal lying nearby. He held it awkwardly between his fingers and began to scribble on a fresh page of his sketchbook. As he concentrated, Clara watched with bated breath, hoping this act of creation would unlock something deeper within him. Clara's heart soared at his willingness to share. A beautiful tree, I can see it, she praised, her voice laced with enthusiasm as she leaned closer to admire his work. The day seemed to rush by. They ate the lunch Clara prepared and had another impromptu game of tag. When they finally returned to the house, the sun dipped low in the sky. Clara felt a contentment that she hadn't felt for a long time. Later that evening, Clara settled into the worn leather chair by the fire, the flames flickering in a dance of gold and orange. She glanced over at Jack, who leaned back against the log wall, his rugged features softened by the firelight. You had a great idea, suggesting the hike. I think Ethan had fun. It was a nice day, wasn't it? Clara asked. I'm glad that you agreed to my crazy plan. You draw quite well. Did you take any art classes when you were young? Jack asked. Clara hesitated for a moment, considering how to weave her past into words. Not really, she admitted, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her sketchbook resting on her lap. I spent most of my time drawing with my sisters. We taught each other, I guess you could say. My family didn't have a lot of money, so we'd gather scraps of paper and whatever pencils we could find. A soft smile crept onto her lips as she recalled those carefree afternoons. Two sisters? Jack asked, leaning forward slightly, intrigued. Yes, she said, warmth blooming in her chest. They were my best friends growing up. We'd create entire worlds with our drawings, hiking up to the hills near our home, or painting wildflowers we found in the fields. Jack listened intently as Clara continued. I always dreamed of becoming an artist one day. I wanted my art to bring joy to others. Her voice held a tremor of uncertainty, but beneath it lay vibrant hope that shone through like sunlight breaking clouds. It sounds like you had quite the imagination, Jack remarked softly, admiration evident in his tone. I did, Clara replied, her green eyes shimmering in the firelight as she looked directly at him. But life, well, it got complicated. She glanced away for a moment, feeling a familiar tug at old wounds. Jack shifted closer to her side of the fire, his warm gaze encouraging her to continue. You have that talent, Clara. It's shining through, he said earnestly. I would love to see what you have in that sketchbook. She met his eyes again and felt a rush of gratitude wash over her. In that moment, surrounded by crackling flames and shadows dancing across their faces, she knew he understood something profound about her. Something more than just her past struggles. She hesitated for a moment before sliding her sketchbook towards him. Jack's fingers brushed against hers, sending a shiver down her spine as he opened the pages. He leaned closer, studying the vibrant sketches she had created. Flowers blooming in wild abandon, trees swaying gently under the sun, and children playing in meadows. This is beautiful, he murmured, his voice filled with admiration as he turned each page. When he reached the last one, he paused. Is this your family? She could only nod. What happened to your family? Clara's heart sank as she searched for words that wouldn't betray the sorrow lodged within her. She swallowed hard, feeling tears prickle at the corners of her eyes. They died in a wagon accident, she whispered, her voice trembling. My parents and my 2 sisters. They were on their way to market when a storm hit. Her throat tightened as she recalled that fateful day, a chilling mix of regret and wonder swirling within her. I was sick with a cold, Clara continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. If I hadn't been ill— She paused, overwhelmed by the weight of what could have been. I might have been with them. Jack shifted closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as she fought against tears that threatened to spill over. I'm so sorry, he murmured softly, holding her tightly. I know what it's like to deal with loss and grief. The dam broke then. Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks as Jack pulled her into his embrace. He didn't say anything more, he just held her as she wept for the family lost too soon and for moments forever changed. Their gazes met, a silent conversation sparking between them, and Clara's breath caught in her throat, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. As Jack leaned in slowly, she could feel the tension in the air, thick and charged. His lips brushed against hers, tentative yet electric, igniting a rush of warmth that spread through her. Time seemed to suspend, and for that brief moment, nothing else existed but the intimate connection they shared, the mingling of their breaths, and the profound warmth that enveloped them, erasing every worry and doubt. When they finally pulled apart, Clara's heart raced with exhilaration, a wave of joy flooding through her like sunlight breaking through the clouds after a storm. She could hardly believe the moment they had just shared. The warmth of his presence lingered against her skin. It felt as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis, and in that brief interlude, all her doubts and insecurities melted away, leaving only the pure delight of this unexpected connection. With exhaustion from emotion tugging at her limbs, she made her way to bed later that night, feeling lighter than air. Her heart was full from the connection forged not only with Jack but also with Ethan throughout their perfect day together. As she closed her eyes, hope blossomed anew within her. She held the unshakable belief that they could heal together, and that Jack would find solace enough to share his own burdens too. Chapter 7. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over Clara as she stirred awake. The remnants of her dreams lingered like the scent of wildflowers, and a smile crept across her face. Today felt promising, filled with the potential for laughter and connection. She slipped out of bed and began her morning routine, excitement bubbling within her. She wondered how long she would have to wait until she could experience Jack's kiss again. He had left early to tend to the ranch, his warmth still lingering in the air. Clara busied herself in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, thinking of Ethan and their adventures ahead. She could already envision them exploring the fields again, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. The cheerful atmosphere shattered abruptly when Martha and Roy arrived at the door. Clara turned to greet them, but their stern expressions immediately doused her enthusiasm. "Morning, Clara," Martha said curtly, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Good morning," Clara replied, determined to be cheerful and welcoming, but her voice faltered slightly under Martha's scrutiny. Roy's brow furrowed as he surveyed the kitchen. "We would like to have a word with you. You're spending too much time playing games with that boy," he said bluntly. "Ethan needs a firm hand." Clara's heart sank at his words. "I believe in nurturing him," she countered gently. "He has been through a lot. He needs support right now, not rules and restrictions." "Nurturing doesn't mean letting him run wild," Martha interjected sharply. "Children need structure and discipline." Her tone carried an edge that made Clara bristle. "He shouldn't be spending all of his time drawing in that darn book." But Ethan is healing from so much loss. Encouraging him to express himself through art helps him process what he's been through. She had to force herself to stay calm. There was a part of her that wondered if they had purposefully waited until they knew Jack had left the house. Roy shook his head disapprovingly, arms crossed tightly like Martha's. Art doesn't put food on the table or teach him responsibility. His voice held a finality that sent chills down Clara's spine. "We feel that Ethan should be spending his days with Martha. Think about what we've said." The older couple left without another word. The moment the door closed behind them, Clara collapsed in a chair, wanting to bury her face in her hands and weep. She had never dealt with such animosity towards her before, and she didn't know what to do. She sighed after her visitors left, grateful they were gone. As she turned back to her chores, she heard a faint sound in the hallway. "Ethan?" she called. Her heart dropped when she heard footsteps run towards his room and a door slamming. She immediately knew that there had been a small figure lurking just beyond the doorway, listening to every word Roy and Martha had said to her. She started to walk towards Ethan's room, determined to comfort and reassure him, when she suddenly had an idea. Heading to her room, she opened her trunk. She carefully retrieved a brand-new sketchbook that had been tucked under an old dress, its crisp pages just waiting to be filled with imagination. Next, she lifted out a tin of watercolor cakes, their vibrant hues promising endless possibilities. Finally, she found 2 brushes, their bristles soft and ready to dance across the page. Initially intended for her own artistic pursuits, a spark of inspiration ignited within her. She realized that Ethan would likely find joy in exploring this new art medium. She smiled as she envisioned the creativity that could blossom in his small hands. It didn't take her long to set up a small area on the kitchen table for these new art supplies. She filled a cup of water and added some scraps of fabric to wipe up any spilled paint. "Ethan, come here. I have something I would like to show you," she called, her voice bright and inviting. No response came from his room. Clara's heart sank as she called again 2 more times. Concerned, she walked down the hallway and pushed open his door. She smiled faintly as she found him curled up on his bed, his sandy blonde hair tousled, a faint light casting shadows across his small figure. "Hey there," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "You want to draw with me? I have something fun to show you." He stirred slightly but kept his eyes closed, turning away from her gaze. A sense of helplessness washed over Clara as she studied him. "Ethan," she asked softly, "are you hungry? I can get out some of those cookies you helped me make yesterday." Still no reply. It was then she realized that he was asleep and not ignoring her words as she had thought. She reached out to smooth some of his sandy hair away from his face, and it was then she realized that he had been crying. Clara watched Ethan sleep for a long moment and then decided that it would be safe to leave him alone in the house. She really needed to let Jack know what had happened with Martha and Roy. Leaving Ethan's room, she stepped outside into the fresh air, taking a moment to gather her thoughts before heading toward the barn, hoping she'd find him there. The sun glinted off the wooden structure as Clara approached, each step heavy with dread over what lay ahead. She wasn't sure what Jack's reaction was going to be after he heard her story. She stepped into the barn, the scent of hay and leather wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Jack stood near a stall, brushing down a chestnut mare, his muscles flexing with each stroke. The sight of him stirred something warm within her, but the weight of her earlier conversation hung heavy on her heart. "Jack," she called softly, hesitating for just a moment. He looked up, brow furrowing as he sensed the tension in her voice. "What's wrong?" He set the brush aside and approached, concern etched across his features. Clara took a breath before speaking. "I need to talk to you about Martha and Roy," she began hesitantly. "They came into the kitchen after you left, and, well, it wasn't a very pleasant conversation. And Ethan, he heard everything. Martha and Roy, what did they say to you?" They're worried about me spending time with Ethan. They think I'm not providing enough structure." She tried to smile. "They weren't happy that we took Ethan off the ranch yesterday." Jack's expression shifted to one of defensiveness. "They're just trying to look out for him," he replied, crossing his arms as if to shield himself from Clara's words. "Remember, they've helped me quite a bit with Ethan over the last few months." Clara frowned. Did he really believe she was making it all up? "I know they mean well," she pressed on, feeling frustration rise in her chest. "But Ethan did overhear the conversation, and it upset him greatly. Where is he now?" He ran to his room and shut the door. I let him be for a few minutes and then went to check on him. He cried himself to sleep. Maybe he was just tired. Sometimes he doesn't sleep well, Jack commented as he leaned against the stall. I thought you wanted to give Ethan something different, a chance to heal through creativity and love. Clara, Jack started, but she cut him off. No, you married me because you believed I could make a difference in his life. Her green eyes met his warm brown ones, searching for understanding beneath his protective demeanor. The silence stretched between them as Jack processed her words. She watched his jaw tighten as he grappled with the conflict swirling inside him, loyalty to his family versus hope for Ethan's future. I want what's best for Ethan too, Clara continued, softer now, but I can't do it alone if you doubt my intentions. Jack remained silent for a heartbeat longer before looking away, his jaw tightly clenched. Clara held her breath, wishing he could see how much she cared. Not just for Ethan, but for him too. For she suddenly realized that she was falling in love with this man. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing heart. Jack, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I never thought I'd be in a position like this. Part of the reason I answered your ad was because I wanted to be a mother. But I am not sure I am the right woman to be a mother for Ethan. I'm so afraid. His gaze softened in concern as he leaned closer. What are you afraid of? I worry that I won't know what to do when things get tough, she confessed, feeling a wave of vulnerability wash over her. What if I fail him? What if I can't reach him the way he needs? She gave a small sigh. What if I make things worse? Jack shifted his weight, visibly considering her words. You're already doing more than you think, he replied quietly. Ethan looks up to you. You give him something I can't. His warm brown eyes met hers, and for a moment the world around them faded. For what it's worth, I think you are doing a fine job. I don't want to let him down, Clara admitted, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Every time he withdraws into himself, it breaks my heart. Jack's expression turned pained as he opened up. I'm scared too, he said, his voice low and earnest. Every day I wonder if I'm enough for him, if I'm doing right by Ethan after losing his mother. Clara's heart broke and she reached out to grasp his hand. I know that Martha and Roy aren't happy about the changes. I am being honest, that they helped me a lot when I couldn't do it all myself, not only raising Ethan but taking care of this ranch. You are doing the best you can, Clara responded. I noticed that you cared for Ethan right from the moment you met him. You don't know how much that means to me, Jack murmured, inching closer until their breaths mingled softly in the warm barn air. Clara leaned forward instinctively, drawn by an invisible force that pulsed between them, an aching need for connection that surged through her veins. Just as their lips were about to meet, Jack stiffened suddenly, a flicker of alarm crossing his face, as if he sensed something amiss beyond their bubble of intimacy. What is it? Clara whispered breathlessly. Before Jack could respond, Roy stepped into the barn with a clatter of boots against the wooden floorboards. Clara felt her heart plummet at the interruption. She was just about to experience another kiss from Jack when Roy appeared. The older man seemed to have known what he interrupted, and he glared at them both. I need to check on Ethan, she blurted out hastily, pulling away from Jack and turning toward the door with urgency gripping her chest. She couldn't let Roy see this moment between them, this fragile spark of vulnerability that had almost ignited into something more. Chapter 8. Clara paused just outside the barn door, her heart racing. The sun filtered through the cracks, casting lines of light across the dusty ground. She hesitated, torn between stepping away and wanting to hear what Roy had to say about her. Jack, Roy's voice boomed from within, steady and unyielding. We need to talk about Clara. The words settled like a stone in Clara's stomach. She clenched her fists, feeling an impulse to turn and leave, but curiosity anchored her in place. I don't think she's the right fit for this family, Roy continued, his tone dripping with skepticism. Ethan needs structure. He needs a firm hand. You can't let her coddle him like some art project. Clara felt heat rush to her cheeks at Roy's dismissal of her intentions. Each word felt like a jab at her efforts, and she fought the urge to storm inside and defend herself. Roy, Jack replied with a bit of frustration, I get where you're coming from, but But nothing, Roy cut him off sharply. She doesn't know how to handle kids who've been through what Ethan has. Clara pressed her back against the rough wood of the barn door, frustration bubbling up inside her. She's trying, Jack said finally, his voice softer but still lacking conviction. I've seen it in how she interacts with him. That flicker of support sent a spark of hope through Clara, yet it quickly faded as Roy snorted dismissively. Trying isn't enough when you're raising a boy who needs more than just kindness. You know what happened with his mother. Clara flinched at the mention of Ethan's mother. How could they use that pain against her? She shifted on her feet, heart pounding louder with every second she listened. I understand your concerns, Jack answered, but you haven't even given Clara a chance. Don't write her off because she doesn't fit into your idea of what's right. There is more than one way to raise a child. Silence followed Jack's words, and Clara felt a surge of disappointment wash over her. Where was his strength? Where was his defense? The trust she had hoped to build between them now hung precariously on a thread as thin as air. Just think about it, Roy finally said with finality. You need to do what's best for Ethan. You haven't been married to her long. I'm sure it will be easy enough to send her back where she came from. With that last statement echoing in Clara's ears, she turned away from the door, feeling a weight settle heavily on her chest as she grappled with the reality of Roy's doubts. Clara glanced back at the barn, uncertainty gnawing at her. What if Ethan woke up alone in the house? She wanted to hear more of the conversation, but she also knew it would be better if she went to check on Ethan. Inside the house, she tiptoed to Ethan's room, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. There he lay, curled up under his blanket, his sandy hair tousled and soft against the pillow. Relief washed over Clara, but it was short-lived. A knot formed in her stomach as she considered their fragile situation. Was this marriage even going to work? She had only been here a week, yet it felt like a lifetime of worries had already crept in. Clara retreated to her own room and sat at the small desk where she had unpacked her drawing supplies. The familiar texture of sketch paper soothed her fraying nerves. With each stroke of her pencil, images began to take shape. Her parents laughing around a table, her sisters playfully bickering over art supplies or a new dress. Those moments echoed in her mind like distant music, haunting yet beautiful. Tears blurred her vision as memories of family washed over her. These were faces she would never see again, and love that felt irretrievable. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, willing the sadness away. She couldn't afford to dwell on what she had lost. Doing so threatened to suffocate any hope she held for this new life with Jack and Ethan. Yet fear gripped her tightly. What if Jack decided Roy and Martha were right? What if he pushed her away? What if all this effort proved fruitless? Her pencil hovered above the page, trembling with unspent emotion. A sense of inadequacy seeped into every line she drew. How could she nurture Ethan when it felt like she was struggling to find solid ground herself? I can't live in a house where my efforts don't matter, Clara whispered into the stillness around her, choking on grief that felt as heavy as stone. She drew mindlessly for almost an hour before she realized she had done so. She had spent the last hour lost in her thoughts, trying to quell the tide of insecurity crashing against her. Setting her sketchbook aside, Clara stood outside Ethan's door, determined to check on him. She'd wake him up if he were still asleep. He had rested long enough. She gently pushed the door open and gasped as she instantly noticed that the room was empty. The blankets were askew, as if he had tossed them aside in a hurry. Panic coursed through her veins. "Ethan!" she called loudly, stepping inside and scanning the small space. The drawing materials she had given him lay untouched on the floor. Her heart raced as she darted through the house, checking every corner and shadowed nook. She peeked into the kitchen, glancing behind chairs and under tables, all the while calling his name until it seemed to echo off the walls. There was nothing. A sense of dread wrapped around her as she moved to the living room, where sunlight streamed through the windows but felt cold against her skin. Hadn't he been just here? Hadn't she promised herself to keep an eye on him? Clara's mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened. What if he wandered outside alone? What if he got hurt? Guilt gnawed at her insides. Why hadn't she heard him slip away? Why hadn't she been more vigilant? She ran towards the barn. Even though she dreaded telling Jack that his son was missing, she also felt confident that he would know what to do. He would have some idea of where Ethan might be hiding. The barn loomed ahead, its familiar wooden structure a sanctuary against her growing fear. She paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath before pushing open the heavy door. "Jack!" Her voice trembled as it filled the space. Concerned at her tone, he looked up from where he was organizing farm tools. "What is it?" "I can't find Ethan," Clara blurted out, chest tightening with panic. Jack's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "What do you mean, you can't find him?" "He's missing. I checked everywhere. I thought maybe he was drawing or playing quietly, but he left his room, and I can't find him." Chapter 9. Clara's heart raced as she faced Jack, the weight of her words heavy in the air. She braced herself for his disappointment, expecting the criticism to tumble out like a torrent. Instead, he called for Roy with urgency that surprised her. "Roy!" Jack's voice boomed through the barn, a command that resonated with authority. Clara watched as Jack shifted into action, urgency replacing the worry on his face. He moved with purpose, his hands clenching and unclenching as if searching for something to hold on to. Roy appeared almost instantly, with his eyes scanning the barn as if it held answers. The moment he caught sight of Clara, his expression hardened. "What's going on?" Roy demanded, glancing between Clara and Jack. "Ethan's missing," Jack replied quickly. "We need to search the ranch." The stocky foreman crossed his arms, looking skeptical. Clara could feel his gaze bore into her with unspoken judgments. She felt small under the weight of it, as if he weighed her worth against Ethan's safety. "What do you mean he's missing?" Roy shot back. "How does that happen?" Clara swallowed hard but kept her voice steady. "I thought he was in his room. I didn't realize he had left." Jack's jaw clenched, a flash of anger at Roy's tone passing through him like lightning. "Let's just find him," Jack snapped, dismissing Roy's sharp scrutiny as he turned toward Clara again. "Where did you last see him?" "I thought he was drawing in his room," she stammered, anxiety knotting her stomach tighter. Roy frowned deeply but nodded curtly to Jack before stepping outside into the sunlight. "Search by the creek first. He likes water, so maybe he wandered over there," Jack instructed Clara before following Roy out. As Clara stood alone for a moment, dread coiled around her heart once more. Ethan liked to go to the creek? When they walked alongside it the day before, the water wasn't very deep. But what if he had wandered downstream? Clara joined Jack and Roy as they began to call Ethan as they headed in different directions. Upon hearing the commotion, Martha then emerged from her home, eyes wide and frantic. "What happened?" she gasped, running down the porch stairs without waiting for an answer. "Ethan is missing," Jack called back tersely. "We're looking for him now." Martha's eyes flickered to Clara, but she took a deep breath and joined them without another word. Worry etched across her features as they prepared to scour the ranch together. Clara trailed behind Jack, Roy, and Martha as they combed the vast expanse of the ranch. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, and with each passing moment her worry deepened. She could see it etched on Jack's face, a fear that made her heart ache. "Ethan!" Jack called out again and again, his voice strained. The only reply was the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the cattle in the fields. Clara pressed her lips together, her stomach twisting into knots. She tried to shake off the anxiety clawing at her mind, but found it increasingly difficult. After another round of searching yielded nothing but silence, Clara paused beneath an old oak tree, closing her eyes. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady her racing heart. "Please," she whispered under her breath, "keep him safe." A sudden thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. On their hike to the mountains there had been a shade tree they had stopped under. Ethan had loved that area and hadn't wanted to move on. Without a word to the others, Clara took off in that direction. Her feet carried her swiftly over familiar ground as hope surged within her. The trail meandered through a grove of trees before opening up to a small clearing where wildflowers swayed gently in the wind. Clara's heart raced with determination and fear mingling together. "Ivan!" she called out as she stepped into the sunlight filtering through the leaves. She scanned the area for any sign of him, his sandy hair glinting in the sun or his small figure lost among the tall grass. And then Clara spotted a small figure hunched beneath a sprawling oak tree, a wave of relief washing over her. Ethan sat cross-legged on the ground, his concentration fixed on a book in his lap, surrounded by an array of colored pencils scattered around him like fallen leaves. The pencils Clara had given him. "Ethan," she called as she approached, "there you are." He glanced up briefly, but his blue eyes were clouded with something that sent a chill through Clara's heart. She settled beside him in the grass, her knees drawn to her chest. "We've been worried about you," Clara said gently. "Why did you leave? Didn't you know we would be looking for you?" Ethan remained silent, his gaze dropping back to his sketch as if it held all the answers he couldn't articulate. The weight of unspoken thoughts hung between them like a thick fog, and Clara's stomach tightened at the continued realization that he had overheard her earlier conversation with Roy and Martha. She reached out tentatively and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I understand you're upset, Ethan. It's a lot to take in. There have been a lot of changes in your life, your mother, my arrival, everything." His small frame trembled slightly under her touch, and the tension in the air shifted abruptly. Tears pooled in Ethan's eyes before spilling down his cheeks, each drop carving out deep grooves of sorrow. Clara's heart broke at the sight of his anguish. He turned away from her, burying his face into his arms as sobs racked his thin body. The sound pierced through Clara like shards of glass, pulling at every protective instinct within her. "Oh, sweet boy," she murmured, wrapping her arms around him and drawing him close. "I'm so sorry." She held him tightly against her side while he wept, each sob echoing the turmoil swirling within both their hearts, his grief over losing his mother, and her own fears of inadequacy in filling that void. She stroked his sandy hair gently, whispering soft reassurances as he clung to her. The world outside faded away, replaced by the rhythm of his sobs and the quiet rustle of leaves overhead. She could sense Jack and the others searching nearby, their voices calling out for Ethan, but nothing mattered more than this moment. With each cry that escaped him, Clara felt a surge of determination. She wanted him to know he was safe with her. She wouldn't let him slip away like so many others had in her life. Just let it out. "It's okay to cry," she murmured, her voice soothing and low. "I'm here." Time stretched as they remained beneath the oak tree. Gradually, Ethan's sobs subsided into soft hiccups, until silence wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. Clara felt a flicker of hope igniting within her. Perhaps this was the breakthrough they both needed. Ethan shifted slightly, pulling back just enough to look up at Clara with tear-streaked cheeks. The vulnerability in his big blue eyes stirred something deep within her, an overwhelming desire to protect him at all costs. "I miss her," he finally whispered, his voice small and fragile. Clara's heart leaped at the sound of his words. He spoke. She nearly wanted to jump for joy at this sign of connection, but then she froze, caught in the gravity of what he had said. The finality of his statement hung heavily in the air between them. She knew she needed to not overreact that he had spoken after so long, and focus on what he had just said. "I know you do," Clara replied gently, trying to maintain her composure despite the ache that lodged itself in her throat. Ethan's gaze fell back to the open sketchbook sprawled across his lap. "I tried to draw her, but I can't make it look right." "What do you mean?" Clara asked softly, desperate to encourage him further. "She doesn't look like me anymore." His voice trembled as he spoke, revealing a layer of pain that echoed deep within Clara's own experiences. She watched Ethan, her heart heavy as he sat before her, his small hands trembling. She sensed the weight of his words, each one a fragment of a painful truth he had kept locked away. The vulnerability in his big blue eyes cut through her like a blade. "It was my fault," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara felt a tightness in her chest as she leaned closer, wanting to reassure him, but knowing that this moment required silence. He needed to share his burden. "I wanted to ride the horse," he continued, his voice trembling. "Mama said no at first." She could picture it as Ethan spoke. A sunny day, laughter ringing out as a child begged for something he wanted so desperately. The warmth of the sun mingled with the chill of what lay beneath those innocent memories. "She finally let me and helped me get on in front of her," he said, staring at the ground as if it held all the answers. I wanted to go fast. A knot formed in Clara's throat as she listened to him unravel his past, each word tumbling from his lips like stones falling into an abyss. She could see how he replayed that moment over and over in his mind. I yelled because I was so happy, Ethan confessed, his voice breaking. I scared the horse. It started running. Clara's heart sank further into the depths of grief for this little boy who carried such an unbearable weight on his young shoulders. Then, he hesitated, struggling against tears that threatened to spill again. The horse tripped. Mama fell off and hit her head on a rock. His small frame shuddered under the gravity of his words. She died because I wanted to ride with her. The anguish etched on Ethan's face twisted Clara's heart painfully. Each syllable felt like it carved deeper wounds into both their souls. His guilt and grief intertwining with hers as she absorbed the enormity of what he believed was true. Ethan, Clara began softly but paused, unsure how to unravel the tangled emotions that ensnared him. It's my fault, he repeated, shaking his head fiercely as if trying to dislodge those dark thoughts clinging tightly to him. Clara reached for him instinctively, wanting nothing more than to shield him from this pain that threatened to consume him whole. She took a deep breath, searching for the right words to ease his pain. I lost my family too, Clara said softly, feeling the sting of memories long buried. They died in a wagon accident. I wasn't there. I couldn't save them. I was home in bed with a cold. The words tumbled out, unbidden and raw. She glanced at Ethan's tear-streaked face, wishing she could shield him from the hurt that life sometimes inflicted. Do you think their death is my fault? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head fiercely, eyes wide with disbelief. No, you didn't do anything wrong. You couldn't help being sick. She nodded slowly, feeling a glimmer of hope that he understood the gravity of their shared pain. Exactly. It was an accident, just like what happened to your mother. Ethan stared at her, confusion clouding his features as if trying to reconcile her words with his own burden of guilt. Accidents happen, Clara continued gently. They can be terrible and unfair, but they don't mean you're to blame. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead as she spoke, and took a wild guess with her next words. But not talking about it, keeping it all inside, won't stop bad things from happening again. His small face scrunched up in thought as he processed her words. Clara felt a flicker of connection forming between them, a fragile thread woven through shared grief and understanding. Talking helps, she added softly, hoping to penetrate the wall he had built around himself. It doesn't make the pain go away, but it lets others help you carry it. Ethan's gaze dropped to his drawing again, contemplating her message with newfound awareness glimmering in his blue eyes. The air around them buzzed with possibilities, an unspoken bond beginning to blossom amid the heavy weight of their shared losses. Clara felt a weight lift slightly as she watched Ethan's small face begin to relax, the storm of emotions slowly fading. Let's go back to the barn, she suggested gently. Your father will be worried. Ethan nodded, his expression still solemn but more resolute. As they walked side by side, Clara couldn't help but steal glances at him. She hoped he understood that sharing his burden was the first step toward healing. When they reached the barn, Jack walked around a corner and Clara's heart quickened. Dirt covered his face, his shirt was torn, and his pants coated with mud. Worry etched across his rugged features, which immediately left when he spotted Ethan. "Ethan!" Jack rushed forward and swept his son into a hug, lifting him into his arms. Clara felt a flutter of warmth in her chest as she watched them. "I was so worried," Jack murmured, pulling back just enough to look Ethan in the eye. "You can't just wander off like that." Ethan sniffled but managed a small nod. Martha and Roy stood nearby, their expressions hardened like stone as they took in the scene. Clara sensed their disapproval lingering in the air, and she sighed, knowing what was going to happen next. "Where did you find him?" Jack asked. "He's just—" Clara started, but was interrupted. "Just what?" Roy spoke sharply, folding his arms across his broad chest. "Running off because you've upset him? Is that it?" Clara's heart sank further as she felt their accusatory gazes bore into her. She opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again. They would never believe anything she could say. "It's not her fault," Jack said defensively, casting a glance at Martha and Roy while still kneeling beside Ethan. "Isn't it?" Martha interjected with a pointed look at Clara. "This is exactly why we said he needed structure." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire, stifling Clara's thoughts. The words churned inside her mind. She knew that nothing she could say would change their minds about her. Chapter 10. Clara remained quiet, her heart heavy as Martha and Roy continued to voice their criticisms. Each word felt like a blow, their voices melting into a dull roar in her ears. She watched Ethan, whose gaze flicked between the adults, uncertainty shadowing his features. Suddenly, a shout pierced the tension. "No, stop!" Ethan's voice rang out clear and strong, startling everyone into silence, all eyes turning toward him in shock. Clara's heart raced. Had he really just spoken in front of his father, Martha, and Roy? A glimmer of hope sparked within her. Jack knelt down beside his son, his expression shifting from surprise to pure joy. He pulled Ethan into a tight embrace. "You spoke! You're okay!" The warmth of his father's pride wrapped around Ethan like a protective shield. Ethan leaned into Jack's side, visibly relieved but still shaken. As Clara absorbed the moment, her heart swelled with happiness for them both. But Jack wasn't finished. He stood up straight and faced Martha and Roy, determination etched on his face. "This constant criticism of Clara needs to stop." His tone held a firmness that brooked no argument. It wasn't Clara's fault that Ethan ran off. She was the one who found him. Martha opened her mouth to protest, but fell silent under Jack's steady gaze. Roy shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak either. Clara stood back, astonished by Jack's defense of her role in their lives. He continued, challenging the very foundation of their words and views. "Clara cares about Ethan more than you two realize. She's been nothing but kind to him." With each word Jack spoke, Clara felt layers of doubt begin to peel away from her heart. He was standing up for her, someone who had only just entered their lives, and it filled her with warmth she hadn't expected to feel so soon. "She's trying to be a good mother to Ethan," Jack said, frustration lacing his voice as he glanced at Martha and Roy again. "She deserves our support, not scorn." In that moment, amidst the simmering tensions and critical gazes from Martha and Roy, Clara found herself buoyed by Jack's unwavering conviction in her worthiness, as both a caretaker and a partner in this new family of hers. "Martha and Roy," she began, her voice firm yet gentle, "I think that we all want what's best for Ethan. But we have to recognize that love isn't always about structure and discipline. Sometimes it's about understanding." Martha crossed her arms tightly, her stance rigid. "And sometimes it's about boundaries, Clara. A child needs guidance." "Guidance is important," Clara interjected, feeling the weight of their gazes upon her. "But unconditional love can't thrive in a world of rules alone. It needs space to breathe." Ethan shifted slightly closer to Jack, his little hand grasping his father's shirt as if seeking reassurance. Clara caught a flicker of uncertainty in his blue eyes and pressed on. "Ethan lost his mother," she said softly, her heart aching for him. "He needs to know that he can express himself without fear of judgment. When he talks about what he feels, that's when healing begins." Jack nodded, looking from Clara to Martha and Roy. "We all have our ways of coping with grief," he added, his voice steady. "Clara offers a different perspective, so Ethan can explore those feelings freely." Roy rubbed the back of his neck, clearly wrestling with Clara's words, but not dismissing them outright. Martha looked away momentarily. Clara seized the chance. "I'm not trying to replace anyone or disrupt what you've built here," Clara continued, her heart pounding with each word. "I only want to add more." Silence fell among them like a heavy blanket. Even the animals outside seemed to pause in anticipation. Martha uncrossed her arms slowly and glanced at Roy before meeting Clara's gaze again. I reckon that we all miss Beth," she admitted reluctantly. Roy grunted in agreement, but kept his eyes fixed on Jack rather than Clara. Clara sensed an opening and pressed on gently. "We all want the same thing, a safe place for Ethan to grow up." She looked at each adult in turn, hoping they could see the truth behind her words. Clara watched as Martha and Roy stormed away towards their house, their faces tight with indignation. Jack turned to Clara, gratitude softening his features. "Thank you for finding him," he said, his voice low but steady. "What made Ethan talk?" Clara hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who still clung to Jack's side, the boy's small frame tense. "I think it's best if Ethan tells you himself." Jack nodded, understanding flickering in his warm brown eyes. He crouched down to meet Ethan's gaze. "Son," he said gently, "I'm so glad you're safe. Can you tell me what happened? What did you say to Clara?" Ethan's blue eyes darted to Clara before returning to his father, uncertainty clouding his expression. Taking a deep breath, Ethan spoke up, each word tumbling out with an urgency that surprised Clara. "I told Clara about the day Mama died. I thought it was my fault." Jack's face fell as he processed his son's words. The air thickened with unspoken grief, but Clara sensed a shift, a flicker of understanding in Jack's expression. "It wasn't your fault," Jack replied softly but firmly, kneeling lower so he could look into Ethan's eyes more directly. "Sometimes accidents happen that we can't control." He paused for a moment before continuing. "You know about the horse Mama was riding?" Ethan nodded slowly. "There was a reason the horse stumbled that day," Jack explained gently. "His shoe had come loose just before she rode out. No one knew that." Ethan's eyes brightened as he glanced at the sketchbook and pencils Clara held. She handed them to him. Jack placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "It wasn't because of anything you did. Your Mama loved you so much and would want you to remember her like that. She was full of love and laughter." Clara held her breath as she watched this exchange unfold. Each word Jack spoke seemed to carve away at the weight pressing down on Ethan's small shoulders. After giving Ethan another long hug, he glanced at Clara, but still spoke to his son. "Why not go to the porch and draw for a while?" Jack suggested, his voice warm and encouraging. "I think you've shared enough for now, and I need to talk to Clara." Ethan's eyes brightened as he glanced at the sketchbook and pencils Clara held. She handed them to him. "Go on, buddy," she urged softly. "I'll come and see what you've drawn in a few minutes." With a last look at both adults, Ethan ran to the porch, and he was soon engrossed in drawing, leaving Clara alone with Jack. Jack let out a long breath as soon as the door creaked shut behind Ethan. "Thank you," he said, turning to Clara with a sincerity that made her heart flutter. "I'm sorry I let Roy and Martha's words sway me against you." Clara met his gaze directly, feeling an ache in her chest soften slightly. "You were just trying to protect Ethan," she replied gently. "I understand that." Jack stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking as he searched her eyes for understanding. "But you deserve better than that," he murmured, his voice low but firm. "You're doing everything right for Ethan. He needs kindness more than rules right now." "I just want to help him heal," Clara confessed, feeling exposed under Jack's intense gaze. "Sometimes I worry that I'm not enough." "You are," he asserted fiercely, his hand reaching out to brush against hers lightly. The warmth of their connection sent a shiver through her. Clara felt her heart race as Jack continued speaking from deep within himself. "This isn't just about Ethan, it's about us too." His eyes softened further, holding her captive in their depths. In one swift motion that surprised even herself, Clara closed the distance entirely and pressed her lips against Jack's. The kiss ignited something profound within her, a declaration not only of their shared struggle, but also of hope for their future together. The world around them faded into silence. It was just Clara and Jack, their fears melting away in that single moment. A promise forged in vulnerability and strength. Chapter 11. The sun peeked through the window, casting warm light across the kitchen table where Clara stood preparing breakfast. The aroma of sizzling bacon filled the air, but an unease churned in her stomach as she anticipated the arrival of Martha and Roy. Their criticism from the previous day still lingered in her mind, making it hard to shake off the tension. When they knocked, Clara hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Martha stood there, her curly hair slightly disheveled, and her hazel eyes reflecting something Clara hadn't expected: vulnerability. Roy stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "Clara," Martha began, taking a step forward. "We need to talk." Clara looked confused. She braced herself for more accusations, but nodded for them to enter. She had Jack's support now, if things got out of control again. They shuffled into the kitchen, glancing around at the remnants of breakfast scattered on the table. "I'm sorry," Roy said first, his tone surprisingly soft. "We didn't mean to make things worse yesterday." He looked at Martha, who shifted uncomfortably. Martha stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. "We were just scared. We worried you wouldn't let us be part of Ethan's life anymore, now that you're here." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest at their admission. She glanced between them, seeing their fear laid bare. "I appreciate your honesty," she replied carefully, "but I would never want to take him away from you." Martha's brow relaxed as she took a deep breath, searching Clara's face for reassurance. "Ethan needs family," Clara continued gently, "and that includes you both. He needs a grandma in his life too, doesn't he?" A flicker of hope crossed Martha's face as she processed Clara's words. "But we aren't his grandparents." "What are grandparents?" Clara asked with a smile. Roy and Martha glanced at each other and then back at her, as if they weren't sure what to say. "Grandparents help the adults care for the children. Grandparents spoil them and make them cookies and play with them. Grandparents love them. I think, based on what I've seen, you are grandparents to Ethan." Roy shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "We're just trying to do what's best for him." His dark eyes softened as he regarded Clara with newfound respect. "Thank you for saying that," Martha murmured as she wiped tears from her eyes. Her heart swelled as she watched Martha and Roy share a tentative smile. Clara felt a hand on her shoulder and she looked at Jack, who stood beside her. "I couldn't have said it any better myself," Jack said. "In fact, I have it on good authority that we've been invited to the Hawthorne Ranch for lunch. Why don't you join us?" Ethan, who had been quietly drawing at the table, perked up at his father's words. His big blue eyes sparkled with excitement as he looked between Clara and Jack. "Can I bring my sketchbook?" he asked, his voice still shy but laced with eagerness. "Of course," Clara replied, beaming at him. "We'll find some great spots for you to draw on the way." Martha's eyes twinkled as she interjected, "And I made a cake yesterday." "I can bring that." "Yeah," Ethan shouted and then looked at Clara. "She makes the best cakes." "I'm sure she does," Clara agreed. Roy nodded in agreement, his earlier skepticism fading. "Nothing like a day spent with people you love," he added, allowing a hint of warmth into his tone. "And cake." He leaned over and gave Martha a kiss on her cheek. Clara laughed as Martha's face flushed with her husband's praise. She liked to see this side of Roy and Martha. As they prepared for their ride to the Hawthorne Ranch, Clara felt an undeniable sense of belonging start to take root within her. She joined Martha in gathering supplies while Jack and Roy organized the wagon. Their laughter mingled with the crisp morning air as they shared stories about ranch life. Jack glanced over at Clara with a soft smile as he tossed supplies into the wagon. "You really did something special yesterday," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. Clara's cheeks warmed under his gaze. "I just wanted to help him see that it wasn't his fault." Jack nodded thoughtfully, appreciation shining in his warm brown eyes. "You have a way of connecting with him." They exchanged smiles, simple yet loaded with unspoken understanding, as Ethan returned from his room clutching his sketchbook tightly against his chest. He beamed up at them all, eager for this new adventure. "Are you ready?" Jack asked, ruffling Ethan's sandy hair affectionately before lifting him onto the wagon seat. Clara climbed up beside them, feeling buoyed by this new family dynamic taking shape around her. As they set off across the open fields, Clara glanced back at Martha and Roy, who followed closely behind in their wagon. They were no longer adversaries, but allies, united by love for Ethan and hope for their future together. A few hours later, Clara felt a lightness in her heart as she moved around the kitchen, helping Anna prepare lunch for everyone. She chopped vegetables, her hands moving deftly while Anna stirred a bubbling pot on the stove. "Those look great," Anna said, glancing at the colorful assortment of vegetables Clara had arranged on the counter. Calvin loves his veggies, especially when they're mixed with some good seasoning. I'll make sure to add plenty, Clara replied with a smile. She glanced at Martha, who had settled comfortably at the table, her hands busy knitting a soft green scarf. Martha looked up and met Clara's gaze. "You know, I've always found knitting to be quite soothing," she said, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "It's like weaving little bits of love into each stitch." Clara paused, intrigued by Martha's passion. "I've always wanted to learn how to knit," she admitted, "but I never had anyone to teach me." Martha's face brightened at Clara's confession. "Well, how about you let me show you? I could use some help with this scarf anyway." She gestured toward the colorful yarn that lay scattered across the table. Clara's heart leapt at the thought of sharing this new experience with Martha. "Really? I'd like that." Anna chuckled as she poured broth into bowls. "Looks like we'll have our very own knitting circle in no time." As they worked side by side in the kitchen, laughter echoed around them, a stark contrast to their earlier tensions. Martha explained different stitches while Clara listened intently, feeling more connected to the older woman than ever before. That evening, Clara sat on a well-used blanket spread across the grass, feeling the cool earth beneath her. Jack lounged beside her, one arm draped casually over his knee, engrossed in Ethan's sketching the constellations above. The night enveloped the ranch, a velvet blanket sprinkled with stars. "Look at that one," Ethan exclaimed, pointing toward a cluster of stars. "It looks like a horse galloping." Clara chuckled softly. "You're right. Maybe it's a wild stallion running through the night." Jack smiled as he watched Ethan's enthusiasm light up his face. Clara had noticed that Jack had hardly been able to take his eyes off his son, as if thrilled that he was talking again. "Do you remember our first day together?" Jack asked, turning his attention to Clara, his expression thoughtful. She nodded, warmth blooming in her chest. "You were so guarded. I thought I might never get through to either of you." Jack laughed lightly. "And now look at us." He gestured to Ethan, who was diligently drawing under the twinkling stars. "I couldn't have imagined this moment. Ethan opening up and finding joy again." Clara felt her heart swell at the sight of Ethan's focused expression and innocent joy. "It's amazing what love can do," she said softly. As Clara watched Ethan sketch the stars, the world around her faded away. The gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze and the distant calls of crickets melded into a soft symphony. She turned her gaze toward Jack, who sat beside her, his warm brown eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Clara," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I have something to tell you." Her breath caught as she met his gaze. In that moment everything else fell away, the stars, the laughter, even the weight of past fears. All she saw was Jack's deep brown eyes drawing her in like a current. He leaned slightly closer, the air between them thickening with unspoken emotions. "I love you." Clara felt a surge of warmth envelop her, igniting every corner of her heart. A grin broke across her face as she echoed his words. "You love me?" Jack nodded slowly, vulnerability etched in his features. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly as he took in her joy. "I do," he replied softly. "I love you too," Clara responded with a wide grin. Without hesitation he pressed his lips against hers. It was gentle yet electrifying. It felt like a promise of more to come, a bridge from uncertainty to belonging. When they pulled apart, Jack looked at her with a newfound lightness that mirrored her own joy. "Placing that ad was the best thing I've ever done," he confessed quietly. Clara beamed at him, feeling the truth of his words resonate within her. Everything that had brought them here, the struggles and victories, suddenly felt meaningful and complete. She wrapped her fingers around his hand, holding on tightly as if anchoring herself in this moment of shared understanding and love. "Together," she whispered, allowing herself to imagine a future where they faced life's challenges hand in hand. "We are building a family." "Together," he echoed, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. A gesture that sent shivers down her spine. Ethan looked up from his drawing, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere between them. "Are you two talking about building something? Like a tree house?" Clara chuckled lightly before replying. "Something like that." "Well," Ethan said seriously as he returned to his sketching. "I think you should make it really big so I can invite all my friends." Jack grinned at Clara before turning back to Ethan with an encouraging nod. As Clara gazed up at the starry sky, inspiration washed over her like moonlight breaking through clouds. She envisioned vibrant colors and delicate strokes coming together on canvas. It would be the perfect way to capture not just this moment, but their shared journey ahead as well. Underneath the endless expanse of stars and surrounded by love and laughter, Clara felt whole again for the first time in years.